Well, it seems like the Chicago Bulls front office search has switched from if Matt Lloyd gets the job to when Matt Lloyd gets the job. The question that many people are asking is Dave Lewin actually really coming with him, or is this a pie-in-the-sky dream for the Chicago Bulls fans? Also, seems like Mike Nori could actually be the favorite for the Chicago Bulls. We're going to talk about what's ahead of the Chicago Bulls after they make their front office exec decision, because the timeline here is getting real tight. And so the Chicago Bulls are moving with a much shorter timeline than what they originally had. We're going to talk about all that plus more right after this. What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host there, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that said, let's go ahead and get into this content for today, y'all. So, Joe Cowley had a report yesterday that called Matt Lloyd the front runner, even went so far as to say that he wouldn't be surprised if a front office hire is made here within the next couple of days, and it ends up being Matt Lloyd. Now, there's a lot of things and reactions from Bulls fans. We're going to talk about it all when it comes down to that one, and what that actually means for this team. But I think overall, like, Matt Lloyd was somebody that from the onset, right, basically since this job popped up and Matt Lloyd's name came up, I always kind of felt like, all right, like it's probably going to go to Matt Lloyd. A lot of people kind of felt like that because of the familiarity that he has with the Chicago Bulls front office. I've talked a lot about how the Chicago Bulls did, they went outside of the family for Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley, right? They went outside the family for that, and it was really kind of the first time that they have done that. So, I kind of expected, them to, go somebody that was kind of more of a, I guess you can say, safe pick. We'll talk about how safe the pick actually is here in a second, right? But I think that the success that he had in Minnesota, right, how that helped his reputation around the league. You got to keep in mind this is a guy that worked for years for the Chicago Bulls, over 20 years, I think it was, close to it, and then went over to the Orlando Magic. Had some successes with the Orlando Magic, but very much so that was a situation where during this time with the Orlando Magic, had one of the youngest GMs in league history, and just wasn't a guy that really did pretty well in that situation. He goes over to Minnesota, right? And there's things could happen in regards to that one. I do think that, his shared relationship and history with John Paxson probably helped in these interviews. I've seen a lot of people make a lot about that, but here's the thing. If you guys had a familiarity with somebody and you went to a job interview, you would lean on that familiarity too in the interview process, right? Inside jokes, things like that. So I think that this hire, if it does happen here in the next couple of days, then it makes sense. The draft lottery is on Sunday. After that, the timeline gets really constricted with the draft combine as well. They're quickly approaching. So the question now becomes about, is this the same old Bulls pick, or is this the right pick, right? And we won't really know if it's the right pick until we start seeing the results of the actions that Matt Lloyd or anybody who's hired in this job or this position does, right? Of course, his familiarity and his former, job here in Chicago could be seen as a concern, or it could be seen as a comfort, right? And either one of those could be things that you look at and you're like, hey, both of it. If you're just making the comfortable choice, is it the right choice? And, I had a conversation with my boy, local Bulls fan, on Twitter yesterday, in which it was more so built around Mike Nori, right? And he had mentioned that, if Mike Nori was going to be a great head coach, he would have had a job by now. And, and I understood that, right? My response to him was, well, Tom Thibodeau was an assistant for 20 years before he finally got a head coach. He started being an assistant, I think, in 89. It was either 84 or 89, one of those, before we eventually hired him, in the 2000s as a head coach. So I don't know if that the length of time that somebody sits on the bench necessarily means that they're not a good head coaching candidate, but kind of the similar thing with this Matt Lloyd hire, right? Like, it could be the safe hire and it could be the right hire at the same time. Sometimes those things overlap, and it's actually good for your franchise that the safe and the right hire are the same guy, right? And I think that, his scouting history alone is really what brings him, the thing that I want the most. And I need somebody who can build a team specifically through the draft. You look at a lot of the teams that are in the playoffs right now, And, you know, some of those teams was built through trades. Like the New York Knicks is definitely a team that was built more so through trades than the draft, right? But you look at most of these teams, they were built through drafting really well. Now, you know, drafting well, like, for example, the Boston Celtics, they're out now. But, you know, the Celtics, you know, they drafted Tatum and Brown with picks that weren't their own picks, but still they built through the draft, right? Same thing that you could say about the Cleveland Cavaliers are probably a team that did it through a mix. You know, Evan Mobley was drafted there. Darius Garland was drafted there, but they traded Darius Garland, so you have that. The Pistons did do it through the draft and add some key veteran acquisitions after that as well. So, you know, you have that part of it. But I think when you look at it, like, the thing that is most sustainable is building through the draft. When you have that ability to build through the draft and identify talent well, and even if that gets you a platform and a base of a playoff team, then you could attract that star to get you over the top if you need to. So the scouting history of Matt Lloyd and Dave Lewin, for that matter, but we'll talk about Dave Lewin here in a second. You know, and then when you look at what he did in the Bulls era, like, this is a guy that will scout for, like, Taj, Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah. Now, I know some people are going to say, hey, you don't have to scout Derrick Rose that much, but, you know, I think people forget too in history how much, like, very well Michael Beasley could have been the number 1 overall pick, and many people at that point in time would have looked at it as the right pick, right? Like, so you still have that part of it. And I think the communication and the experience matters hugely in this job, right? But then the other part of Cowley's report came in at Dave Lewin possibly being the GM. Now, you guys will know, and this ain't to toot my own horn, this is just to be factual. I was the first guy to mention, you know, when that came out that the Bulls, you know, an additional candidate in Dave Lewin was being interviewed, and it wasn't like I was reporting it. I floated it around like, damn, it would be really good if the Chicago Bulls were able to add Matt Lloyd and Dave Lewin. And I think now Cowley's reporting added a little bit of color to that, right? You know, he talked about, you know, I said before how there was somebody in the comment section that had mentioned, you know, Dave Lewin would never work under an unproven GM. Why would he take a lesser role and leave the Celtics to work under Matt Lloyd with the Chicago Bulls? Or according to Joe Cowley's reporting, is that, you know, Dave Lewin, it does not have as much confidence in some of the other areas of the job, and those areas being where Matt Lloyd has more experience in. And that's kind of what I talked about when I talked about what the combination of those two guys both could bring to the Chicago Bulls. It could bring, you know, a thing where the job is shared, right? And so at that point in time, like, you have the strengths of one person, the strengths of the other. They overlap some, but then there's some other strengths other places. So, you know, with Dave Lewin and to come in as the analytics leader and the GM under Matt Lloyd, I actually like that combination and pairing a lot. I think what that does for the Chicago Bulls specifically is that it gives you two very strong candidates that are very good at scouting, that are very good at player acquisition, that have shown a propensity to be good on the trade market. You're bringing in Dave Lewin, who has seen really good things done from the Boston Celtics and stuff like that. And I think that his background in scouting, analytics, personnel, and helping bring a championship to the city of Boston, all those things pair really well with Matt Lloyd, who we already know. Matt Lloyd has worked in Chicago. He understands the importance of collaborative effort. He's the right-hand guy under Tim Connolly, much like AK was, right? And so you have that part of it. And so, you know, Lloyd and Lewin together bring balance, expertise, experience, and modern thinking, right? And that is the best of all worlds. And so it seems like if this is the direction that the Bulls really are going in, and I'm saying if because as of right now, everything is still just rumor-based, and until the hiring's actually done, we won't know anything. And even then, we won't know after the hiring's done until, you know, the press conference happens and they're announcing him as the new GM. So we'll see what happens with those things. But I think just this overall, what we're seeing from this team is this. They've moved through this exec search, and they've done it in a way that has led them to getting the right candidates in the door, at least on paper. And with candidates, you only can have the thought process. Like, I go back to all the time. People thought the Bulls got it right when they hired AK. If you go and look at the national media and the response to the Chicago Bulls hiring AK, they at that point thought a lot of things like we're hoping now. The Bulls have hired from a winning organization. They hired a guy that was instrumental in in drafting Jokic in that decision, that had been collaborative with Tim Connolly as well, right? So, like, the right hire is only right hire on paper. And much like I told my boy, local Bulls fan, and, you know, in our conversations, that any fan has the right to have a wait and see approach with anything this team does. No matter how good it looks on paper, they have the right to look at this and say, hey, listen, okay, cool, but show me, right? I said before myself, I'm in the show me era of my Chicago Bulls fandom. You got to show me for me to believe it's real, right? And so with now, it looks like that there's a real possibility, per rumors, that Dave Lewin and Matt Lloyd both can come over together. What does that then mean for the Bulls, right? What does that then mean? Well, the first thing that they have to do is they have to hire their head coach, right? And then the head coach has to hire their staff, but we'll get more on that in a second, is that you have to hire the head coach after that. And in that same report, it looks like Micah Nori is the guy that people are expecting, at least if Matt Lloyd is to be hired, that is going to be the head coaching option. And so, I talked about this a little bit on yesterday's episode where I talked about the possible downside to trying to poach everything from one organization. And in that episode, I talked about, well, that's why I want, Dave Lewin. I would love Dave Lewin to come in as the GM. So at least you're not bringing everything over from the Minnesota Timberwolves and just expecting for it to work here. But Micah Nori continues to be linked to Chicago if Matt Lloyd does get that league exec role. And so now I think that you are looking at alignment there. President, GM, head coach, you are searching for alignment. When you talk about teams that build well over time, that build sustainable success, those are teams usually that have alignment from the front office to the front line, meaning from the front office to the players on the court, right? And you want alignment in a vision and a clear direction in regards to that. And that's what the Bulls have really lacked, right? AK had a vision and he built a team to that vision. And then when that team fell apart because of injury, he never rebounded from that vision very well. You want, alignment for the whole thing. That way, if anything does happen and you do have to make an alteration of your initial plan, everybody's in alignment of doing that, right? And I think at this point, I still would like to see the Bulls conduct a real coaching search. I would have a little bit of issue if Matt Lloyd is hired and then 3 days later we just hear Micah Nori's hired. I still would like to see the Bulls go on an actual search of in an interview process with these head coaches. I think that would be the best thing to do, right? But at the same time, I understand why Minnesota's pipeline is attractive, right? I think we all do. Understand why, there is a little bit of risk being locked in too much to one organization's blueprint, but the Dave Lewin aspect of that adds a different wrinkle to that to where you're not. So the question then becomes about, would this be the dream team for the Chicago Bulls? Matt Lloyd, Dave Lewin, Micah Nori. Is that the dream team to actually lead the Chicago Bulls and get them the fuck out of where they are? And keep in mind, there are a couple of things they're going to need. A vision, right? And that's something that we talk about. Every front office needs a vision, because how else are you building if you don't have a legitimate vision? So A, the vision, right? That's the first thing. B, how do you execute that vision? How aggressive are you going to be to execute that vision? That's what you have to ask yourself. And so I think in that you're looking at saying both Matt Lloyd and Dave Lewin being two guys that have worked themselves up into these organizations, that have worked themselves up to getting to this point. How hungry would they be? They've seen it, right? Matt Lloyd has seen the good and the bad. He's seen that. Dave Lewin has seen the progression to get to the good part of it, right? And so a championship pedigree is great in regards to that. Dave Lewin would be the only one that's really bringing a history of a title to that. So I would love his voice. One thing with Mark Eversley is that Mark Eversley didn't talk. We didn't know what Mark Eversley's job was. We didn't know what he had a say in or what he didn't have a say in. We didn't know any of that stuff with Mark Eversley, because what the hell did Mark Eversley do day to day? Still don't know. But with these guys, you are all getting guys that have held actual responsibility. Dave Lewin, Matt Lloyd, Micah Nori, who his head coach and Chris Finch gives him a lot of credit for how they're able to do adjustments, able to do all those things. And you just hope now that that's going to get you to that place where you want to be. So, at this point now, it seems like this could be the direction. Seems like an execution are going to be different things, right? So again, to recap, what's ahead? You want your front office to have vision. You do want them to have alignment. You want them to be able to know when to be aggressive and also know when to be patient, right? We talk a lot about the aggressiveness and how AK has, missed out on value of players. You don't want that, but you also don't want somebody who moves too aggressively too soon, and then you look back and some of those players that you move, you're like, damn, we actually could have probably made this work, right? So patience where you need it, aggression where you need it as well, and you have to really identify where those two things are needed and where they're going to be different at. And if you can do that, that's where things really work out for you as a front office. So, and then if the Bulls have this hire would be the first step in a lot of things that got to come for the Chicago Bulls. executive hire to come this week. I think you have to have that hire done before May 10th with the draft combine and the draft lottery, right? The draft lottery is this Sunday. Keep that in mind. The draft lottery is this Sunday. We will finally know exactly where our Chicago Bulls are going to pick. More on that here in a second. The draft combine is May 10th through 17th, which is, it starts the same day as the draft lottery. At that point, almost every NBA exec is going to be down at the combine. Every team is going to have representation. You're going to be able to have one-on-one interviews with certain players. You're going to be able to set your in-person workouts. You're going to be able to see some 5-on-5s, 3-on-3s, things like that. You're going to be able to see. But the head coaching search should also intensify over this next week as well once the exec is hired. I think you can go through a draft combine without having your head coach in place. But between the draft combine, which ends on May 17th, and the NBA draft, which comes June 23rd, right? Which you have over a month between those two things, you need to have your coach hired, because when you start bringing in players for those in-person workouts, that's when you want your coach's eyes to also be on it, so they can see how they think things are going to fit on the basketball court in their scheme and things like that. So you have that. Then your head coach is also going to have to fill out their staff, right? You're still going to have your staff filled out with that. So now that's not as important, right? As far as, I don't think you need to rush to have your staff all filled out by the draft, so to say. But, ideally you probably will, but I don't, if that doesn't happen by then, it's cool. You have the NBA draft on June 3rd, and then NBA free agency opens up just a week later on June 30th, right? So since the NBA has condensed this thing down, right, because there used to be more space between the draft and NBA free agency, you have now 6 to 8 weeks to completely reshape the Chicago Bulls franchise, completely reshape the Bulls franchise. And, that, I think, when you comes down to it, you want to see your franchise make the right decisions, because this is the offseason that is really going to determine how the next few years look for the Chicago Bulls, right? So that's my thought process. You guys can let me know how you feel on that part down below. With that said, we're going to talk a little bit about the draft, right? We're not going to get into heavy, analysis with it. But I do think that, with the draft lottery coming up on Sunday, you have to, depending on where the Bulls land, you're going to be able to get different tiers of players, right? I think when you look at it, this draft has kind of separated itself into 3 different tiers, right? 4 different tiers. I think you have tier 1, you have tier 2, you have tier 3, and then you have the tier of players that, have a bunch of potential, but you don't quite know where they're going to turn into, right? So in tier 1, of course, is the top 4 players in the draft. Cameron Boozer, Darren Peterson, AJ DeBonta, Caleb Wilson. And some could even make the case that maybe Caleb Wilson is actually more so in tier 2. But I think that's the tier of players that, if you go into the top 4, those are clearly going to be the top 4 picks. We heard some things like maybe Kingston Flemings or Darius Cuff could flirt into that and pass on one of those guys in the top 4. I think that's all kind of narrative. I don't think that that's something that's actually going to happen. But if the Bulls can get into tier 1, that's your tier where you get players that it doesn't matter what their position is. You draft who you have number 1, number 2, wherever you are on your board in that area, and you figure out the rest later. But then you have the next tier of players where I do have, that's the guards that could end up being elite. Kingston Flemings, Darius Cuff, Keaton Wagler, Braden Burries. Those are players that are in that next tier. Now, of course, we're hoping one of those guys fall to number 9 for the Chicago Bulls. But, those are guys that are all guards. I think they all have really tremendous upsides. They all, I think, look, Darius Cuff, I don't know if he necessarily fits next to Josh Giddey. I don't think the Bulls will trade Josh Giddey immediately. They'll try to make it work out. Keaton Wagler, Braden Burries are 2 of my favorite players in that tier. And then you get into the next tier, which I think are all players that have tons of potential, but you don't know exactly how their career is going to work out for various reasons. Like Mikal Brown is one of the first players in the next tier, right? Because I think that, there's a lot of potential there for Mikal Brown at 6'5". He's another one of those players that's 190 pounds. He's going to have to put on some weight. Nate Ament, LeBaron Fillion, like these players are all really interesting. Yaxel Lindenberg, Ade Mara, right? These are all guys that are in there. And then get into the next tier of guys that are more towards the bottom of the first round that you just don't know for sure, but you see something in, right? The Christian Nick Jr.'s, the Jaden Quantons, right? The guys that I really like in that area. The Cameron Carr, another guard in that area, right? That I think you really would take a look at if you're at number 15, but I wouldn't also be surprised if they go different routes regardless of that. And I guess the tier after that is the rest, right? And the players that you could have a player that shines in there, they could end up being a career role player, they could end up being a bench player. But in this draft, I think with the Bulls having 2 picks and possibly 2 picks in completely different tiers, this is your opportunity. Most people won't argue with best player available, but get the right talent. I think that that's what it has to do. Get the guys that you're going to work with, that you're going to develop, that have the right mindset, that have the right mentality, that are going to put in the work, right? Because at this point now, this is an inflection point. This is a point where the Chicago Bulls, we can look back at this moment, we can look back at this draft and say, hey, the next 3 to 5 years went right or wrong because we got this right or wrong. And that's really what it comes down to. And I think when you look at it, it's very interesting that AK's first pick was Patrick Williams. And the way that Patrick Williams' careers went is kind of the same way AK's 10 years went, where it was like, okay, some initial, okay, this kid looks like he can be really good. And then it was the, all right, can you put it all together? The promise, the hope part, right? And then after that, it was the disappointment that followed after that. And when you realize it was just never going to really get it together. And that was kind of the way that it went with Acme. That's the way that it also went with Patrick Williams. And so, now when you have so much at your disposal coming into year one of a job, 2 picks in the top 20, top 15, the most cap space in the league, those type of things, a open roster. Now you got to go out there and get it done. So let's see if it's not AK and Eversley. First, let's see if we get this hire right. And then let's hope that we start seeing some forward progress to getting this thing where it needs to go, because Bulls fans deserve more. I'm sure that whoever gets hired is going to say that. This fan base deserves more. The city deserves more, because we do. We really do. Now let's hope that we're going to have the right people to go out there and bring it home for us, because if we do, then it could be a lot better times, a lot better days, and hopefully Bulls Nation can all get back on the same page sooner rather than later. So with the Bulls looking like they're close to making the front office decision right now, Matt Lloyd does look like the name to watch, but this cannot be about just one hire. It has to be about taking the direction of the franchise serious. We need structure, we need vision, and we need modern thinking, because we've been stuck in hell for far too long. If that means Matt Lloyd, Dave Lewin, and Mike Inori, cool, great. Then build something real with those guys. Give those guys the tools that they need, because the draft lottery is coming, the combine is coming, the coaching search is coming, and the NBA season is going to be coming soon too. So make sure you guys are locked in with us all season long. Make sure you guys hit that like button on the video. You can subscribe to the channel as well. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode or an upload. You can follow us at Bulls Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, bullscentralpod@gmail.com. And lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the #1 spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, but that is thanks to you, lovely and beautiful people. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See you right if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.